Hi everyone, welcome back to Advanced Scratch. Today we're going to be going over lesson 5. And here's an overview for today's lesson. First we're going to go over the logic for guessing in our game of Hangman, and then we're going to go over the logic for winning/losing. Before we do any of those things though, we're going to start off by setting up the game. Because before we can code the logic for guesses or the system for winning and losing, we have to actually make sure that the game is fully set up. So first of all, we need to add some words to the dictionary so that the player has a word to guess. If you guys remember from last lesson, every time we broadcasted reset, we had the game choose a new random word from the list called dictionary. But if there are no words in this list, then there will be no words for the game to choose, and then the player won't have a word to guess. So that's the first thing that we have to do. Then we need to make sure that all of our variables are set to the correct values. And then finally, we need to reset the game. Remember what we talked about last lesson was broadcasting. So for all of this code, you guys have to add it to this code segment over here, which you should already have in your main sprite. So pause the video and try to do all 3 of these things on your own, and then we will reveal the answer in the next slide. I'm assuming you guys paused the video and took a shot at this. So let's look at the answer. So this is the code segment that should have already been in your sprite. We want to first start off by actually deleting all of the dictionary, because every time we run the program, the lists aren't actually cleared. So if you already had some words in the dictionary, then if you run the program again, those words won't be cleared automatically. It will stay there. And this means that you will have duplicates. So we want to delete all of dictionary, and then we want to add words. So you can add whichever words you want. You can add how many ever you want. In this example over here, it only adds 3 words. It adds son, boy, and dog. You can add more challenging words if you want, though. And then we want to broadcast reset, which, as we talked about last lesson, we created a receive broadcast portion in our code so that we could reset the game when we wanted to. And this is a scenario where we want to use that. We want to reset the game at the beginning of the game. So we're going to broadcast reset. And then finally, we want to set our wins to 0 and losses to 0. So every time the program is rerun, we're starting over, right? We want the wins to be 0 and losses to be 0. So we have to set those variables manually. Now let's talk about the plan for the rest of the game. We're going to answer a few questions that will guide us towards our approach for the rest of the game. So the first question is, when you are guessing a letter, what are the different possibilities that can happen? So pause the video and try to answer this question, or create a list. Okay, assuming you pause the video and you have some ideas, let's look at the possibilities. So when you are guessing a letter, so let's say we have a game of Hangman, and there is this 3-letter word over here. So let's say I guess the letter D, okay? And it's right. So that's one possibility, right? You guess a letter and you actually get it right. So that would be the first possibility. The second possibility would be if you guess a letter and it's wrong. So let's say I try to guess another letter. I guess E. E is not correct, right? So that's a wrong letter. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw another limb, and then we're also going to write E here, because these are all the letters that have already been guessed and were wrong, right? So we're going to draw it here. And then finally, let's look at the third possibility, and that's if you guess a letter which you have already guessed. So let's say I try to guess E again. Nothing's actually going to happen. We're not going to draw another limb, and we're not going to draw anything here because we already guessed E. So in that case, nothing happens. So those are the three possibilities for when you are guessing a letter, right? Now let's look at the next question. When a round of Hangman ends, what are the different possibilities that can happen? So pause the video and think about this again. Make a list. Okay, assuming you guys paused the video, let's look at the answers. There's only 2 possibilities. So the first possibility is, let's say that it's the 3-letter word again. And let's say I'm over here and I'm like, okay, I'm going to guess G. And I get it right. So you have officially won the game if you get to the stage, right? So that is the first possibility. You guess the word successfully and you win the game. What is the second possibility though? Well, if you don't guess the word, so let's say I will write this and I have one more limb left before I lose. And let's say that I'm really having trouble guessing this word. So I'm going to say P, but it's not P either. And then the last limb is drawn and I wasn't able to guess the word successfully. So the hangman is drawn, as you can see over here, and I have lost the game. So those are the two possibilities for for the end of a game of hangman. Now we need to account for all of these possibilities in our code. And the best way to handle multiple possibilities is to use if/else statements. You guys will see this later in our lesson today. We're going to have to use a lot of if and else statements. Something that happens over and over again in Hangman is the player guessing a letter. As you guys know, if we have a game of Hangman, we have to keep on guessing letters until we get the right letter, right? So if I have a bunch of slots over here and I guess A, okay, that's wrong. I guess P, okay, that's right. If I guess D, that's wrong, so we're going to draw another limb. If I guess L, oh, that's right. So as you guys can see, we have to keep on guessing letters and over again. So a question for you guys is, what type of loop do we have to use so that the code repeats forever? Since we have to keep on guessing letters forever, basically, right? So what type of loop allows you to repeat code forever? Pause the video and think about that for a second, and we'll go over the answer. Okay, assuming you guys paused the video, the answer is a forever loop. You can use a forever loop, and whatever is inside here will be repeated forever. So everyone add a forever loop to the bottom of your code, and we will continue from there. Okay, assuming you guys added that forever loop, let's move on. Let's start off by going over the logic for guessing. So that would be these three possibilities over here, which is what happens when a player guesses a letter. We're going to code those possibilities now. So before we can even code those possibilities, we have to actually say the word and ask for a guess. Just like in a game of Hangman, we want to show the player a blank for every letter they haven't guessed yet. And we also need to ask the player for their guess. So if we have a game of Hangman, you draw the blanks so that they can see which letters they haven't guessed. And you also have to ask the player, okay, which letter are you guessing? So I want you guys to write the code for doing these two things in your own program now. So pause the video and try to write the code for this, and we will go over the answer in the next slide. Okay, let's go over the answer. At the beginning of your forever loop, you want to say the word being guessed. If you guys remember, the word being guessed is basically a list with all of the blanks, right? So you want to say the word being guessed for 2 seconds or how many ever seconds you want. And then, if you guys remember from a few lessons ago, we learned about asking the player for player input. So you want to ask, and then the message you can write is enter a letter, or you can say it in a different way. But the point is we want to get a letter from the player. So put this at the beginning of your forever loop, and then we can move on. And just to note is that we will use the answer block in the sensing section for the rest of the code that we're about to write. Okay, so now that we're able to ask the player for the input, we want to look at the three possibilities again, and we want to code each possibility. So it is now time to do that. I want you guys to use if statements and code each of these possibilities. The first possibility being the player guessing a letter, but they get it wrong, so you add a limb to the hangman. The second possibility is you guess a letter which is in the word, so you get a letter right and one of the blanks is filled in. And the third possibility is that you guess a letter which you have already guessed. So remember, use the answer block to check what the player says, and based on what the player says, you want to check which possibility will that fall under. So let's say, for example, our word is dog, right? So we have 3 blanks right now, and we ask the player for a letter and they enter D. That would fall under the second possibility. So we have to write the letter up here, say it again so the player can see they got it right. But if they guess A, that's in the first possibility. They didn't get it right. So we have to add the letter A to the letters that the player has already guessed, and then we have to draw a limb on the hangman, right? And then finally, if they guess A again, for example, then we have to tell them that they've already guessed that letter. So pause the video, use if statements and else statements to code this part of the program. And a hint is that you can put an if statement inside of an else statement. Okay, I'm assuming you guys paused the video and have gone over the answer and tried it out yourself. So we're going to go over the answer together now. So this is just one potential answer. So you want to first have an if statement which checks whether the player is guessing a letter that they have already guessed. And the way that we can do this is we can say if the item number of answer and letters already guessed is greater than 0. So basically what this means is it is checking if there is an item number of the answer in letters already guessed. So remember that letters already guessed is a list. So let's say it's a list which has A, E, and D. And let's say the player's answer, remember, is the letter that the player is guessing. Let's say that the player guesses the letter E. So the program is checking if there is actually an item number for that in this list. And there is, right? It's the second item in the list. And guys, 2 is greater than 0, right? So this is actually a pretty intelligent way of checking whether the player is guessing a letter they have already guessed. They're trying to see if there is an index for the letter they have guessed in this list. And if there is, that means it's greater than 0, right? Now let's look at a scenario where the player doesn't guess a letter that they've already guessed. Let's say they say D. Well, if they guess the letter, or sorry, not D, B. Let's say they guess the letter B. There is no B in this list, right? So there isn't actually an item number for it. So that therefore it's not actually greater than 0. Technically speaking, if you guess a letter which is not in the list, you guess -1 as the item number. And -1 is not greater than 0. So this is checking for if the letter has already been guessed by the player. Now let's look at the rest of the scenarios. There is an else statement over here, and we can put another if statement inside the else statement. So this is to check multiple possibilities, right? So the next possibility we check is if the word contains answer. So basically this is just checking if the word actually has the letter the player guessed. And if it does, then we want to say that they correctly guessed the letter. We want to add the correct letter answer to word being guessed. Remember that this is a custom block we created together a few lessons ago. And then we want to add the answer to letters already guessed, since they just guessed the letter, right? We don't want them to guess it again. And then finally, in the other else statement, the final else statement, this is basically just checking if none of these other things happened, then this must mean that the player didn't guess the letter correctly at all. In which case we say you guessed incorrectly. And then we want to use the next costume block to add the next limb, because as you guys must remember, we had multiple costumes with multiple limbs. So if we were on this costume over here, then if we put next costume, if this code were to be executed, it would go to the next costume, which is this one. So it would look like another limb was added. Finally, we want to change guesses left by -1, since they have one less guess left. And then we want to add the answer to letters already guessed, since they already guessed that letter now, right? So there are other ways to code this part, just keep that in mind. This is just one answer that we have. Okay, good job guys. That was the first part of this lesson, which was the logic for guessing. Now let's go over the second part of this lesson, which is the logic for winning/losing. So remember that there are two possibilities. The first possibility is if the player guesses the word successfully and they win the game. And the second possibility is if the hangman is drawn and you lose the game. So what should happen in the game when each of these scenarios occur? And remember, you can use if statements to check all of these things. Use if blocks to complete this part. So I want you guys to pause the video, and you will need two if statements. You will need one if statement for if the player does this, which is if they win the game and they correctly guess. And then you need another if statement for if the player loses the game because they're not able to guess the word in time. So pause the video and try to create this code. And for this one, you only need 2 if statements. Okay, I'm assuming you guys paused the video and were able to try this out. We will be going over a potential answer now. So a potential answer. Your first if statement is checking if guesses left is less than 1. Now the reason why we're checking this is because if you have less than 1 guess left, that means you have 0 guesses left. And what does that mean? That means that literally all the limbs have been drawn for your hangman. And remember guys, if this is the case, this means you have lost. So this first if statement is actually checking if the player lost the game. And if you do, then you want to say some sort of losing message, like an innocent man died because of you. The correct answer was, and then you want to tell them what the correct answer was. Remember that we have a variable which stores the correct answer called word. So you want to say the word that they got wrong, and then you want to change losses by 1. So we want to add 1 to losses since they lost this game, right? And then finally, we want to broadcast reset because we want to restart the game again. We want to have them play another round. Now let's look at the second if statement. This is if the player won the game. And the way we check this is if we check if the word being guessed is equal to word. Remember that word being guessed is the list which has all the player's blanks, right? So let's say there's 3 blanks and the player has filled in all 3 blanks. And then word is the actual word the player is trying to guess, right? So basically, if the word the player is trying to guess is equal to the word the player has actually guessed, meaning if the player has guessed all of the letters successfully, then it would look like this. It would be like dog equals dog or cat equals cat. It would be, the point is that the player would have guessed the word, right? And in this case, we want to say correct for 2 seconds, and then we want to change wins by 1 since they just won this game, right? And then finally, we want to broadcast reset since we want them to play another round. So once again, there are other ways to code this part. This is just one answer. Okay, guys, this is only one answer, but this is one way you could code this part. That will be all for today's lesson. So today we went over 2 things. We went over how to do the logic for guessing in Hangman, and we also went over how to check if the player has won or lost in Hangman. So at this point, your guys' code should look like this. We should have the one flag is clicked, all of that stuff, and we want to make sure that we are adding words to the dictionary. We're broadcasting reset, setting wins and losses to 0, and then we want to have a forever loop where we have all the guessing logic. We want to ask the player what the letter is that they're trying to guess. We want to check if they already guessed it. We want to check if they got it right or wrong. And then finally, we want to check if they won or lost the game. So we want to check if they lost by having less than 1 guess left, or we want to check if they won because the word being guessed is equal to the actual correct word. So thank you guys so much for watching this lesson. I will see you guys in the next lesson. Bye guys.